Okay, this is Q&A. So you're invited to ask what's on your mind. Yeah.
What is a more powerful or potent bracha? Or receiving a bracha from a big rabbi or your own tefillah?
Well, first of all, just a tiny step of background. Usually, the reason for analyzing which is more potent, A or B, is where you have to choose. You can only have one, and so you want the better one. But when you can have both, the question becomes academic in the pejorative sense of academic. It's only academic, who cares? I don't think we could have a general rule that one is more powerful than the other. And it could very well be that the blessing from a great rabbi will depend upon whether you yourself ask. There's a Hasidic story about a couple who didn't have a child for a long time. They went to the Rabbi and explained their problem. The Rabbi said, if you want a child, 400 rubles. That was like the 10 years salary or something. I think 400 rubles. 400 rubles, but Rabbi, sorry, you want a child? That's the price. 400 rubles. On the table, or, I'll go to the next customer. So they said, well, we can't do it. It's just impossible. So they get up and started to walk out. On the way out, the wife said to the husband, well, I guess we'll just have to pray for ourselves. Then he called them back and said, you think that I'm someone who can dispense divine gifts and so forth and so on? If you're praying for it and you need it, because Baruch Hu recognizes that, I'll add my prayers to yours. But then it means that without the one, the other one's not going to work at all. So you can't possibly decide what to do on the basis of knowing which is more potent. But I don't think there would be a general rule. It would depend upon who you are and what your prayers are, and what your condition is, what your situation is, and who the great person was, and what your connection to him was. Obviously, if a great person prays for his own son, it's different from him praising for someone who needs help, and out of charity he would pay to help that person as well. So I don't think there could be a general hierarchy of which is more potent. Yeah.
More like political question.
So what kind?
More like political question.
Political. You can ask. I mean, an answer, but you can ask. Yeah.
So I come from a very modern Orthodox community, and now that I'm in a more Chareidi environment, what would you say that the argument is for example, they say Chareidis, they don't get involved in the world and they don't apply themselves into the working world, and then Chareidis say that modern Orthodox pick and choose halachas. What's your take on that?
I think that any statement less than 3 hours long would be partial and prejudicial. And my general attitude, the attitude that I have from my Rebbe and from others, is that there are different groups in the observant world, and each group has its advantages and disadvantages. And what a wise person does is to look at each group and try to see what features they have that are positive and are productive and are appropriate, and try to learn from them and try to improve. The idea of, sometimes that means there are things in groups that you want to avoid because you feel that your own way of expressing Yiddishkeit may be hurt by them. That could be. There are weaknesses in certain groups. One shouldn't close one's eyes to that, but one shouldn't focus on that and make that, it sets it up a false competition. It's not a question of competition. It's a question of choosing for yourself a framework in which you feel that you can best use all of your abilities to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I think that the question of how much the study of Torah is emphasized, whether, for example, it's absolutely a 100% rule that post-high school children, boys and girls, both go to full-time Torah learning for a period of time or not. And how, let's say, the example of a couple where the husband spends his whole life learning, how that's looked at. Is it valued or disvalued? Is it criticized? Is it rejected? Is it degraded, or is it looked at as an ideal? So one question will be what your attitude is towards Torah learning, and general expectation for Torah knowledge. What counts as a person having adequate knowledge of halacha and basic philosophical ideas and values and customs and all the rest. What the levels are. And the value of importance. I know that, for example, in the Chareidi world, there are regular critiques that there's not enough emphasis on interpersonal Judaism, as opposed to just between God and man, but not interpersonal. When I used to go to Guru conventions in America, there were always sessions on honesty in business and showing care and concern for other Jews, and for showing respect to other Jews and sympathy for other Jews and so forth and so on. So that was something where they felt that they needed more stress and more emphasis. But I wouldn't want to make blanket overall statements. My Rebbe was committed to and interacted with, I think, probably every Jewish group there is, including Modern Orthodox and including Satmar and including the Sephardi world and including the Yeshiva world, and of course in the Hasidic world. He was part of the whole Mascaret, the whole framework.
Can you give a quick definition of what you would say being Chareidi is?
I don't think there's a neutral definition. There are certain groups that are identified as Chareidi and identify themselves as Chareidi. And there may be groups for which there are disagreements. There can be gray areas, but there's what's called the Yeshiva world. There's what's called the Hasidic world. There's the whole Sephardi world, which belongs to, and they probably would classify themselves as Yeshivish also. So then that would be an overlap. Who else would be part of the? Then you have the borderlines, like Chardal, which is Chareidi Le'umi, people who are Chareidi in all other respects, but not typical of Charedim. They also commit themselves to go to the army. Even though my Rebbe Zatzal told me that you should follow the laws, and if the laws say that you belong in the army, then you should go to the army, and not to pretend that you're crazy and so forth and so on. He didn't hold that way. And I actually, when I came on Aliyah, I had 5 children, and I was 38, I think. But I was eligible for the army, and I went through the preliminary tests. And then when it came to the final signing on the dotted line, they said, well, you have told us that you're a type 1 diabetic, which I was, and we tell you that we will not take responsibility for your health. But otherwise, we're happy to have you. I said, oh, that means you could send me into battle without insulin and that I die? We don't take responsibility for your health. So you can decide to join under those conditions or not. I said, thank you very much. I can't go under those conditions. But he didn't say to my brother-in-law served in the army. So there are some like that, and then there are others who are different. Anyway, that's the rough, what we call it, denotation rather than connotation. We're not talking about the meaning of the term. I don't know if it's reasonable to give a meaning of the term in any sense that would be precise and useful. Yeah.
You just knew I had a question. I didn't have to raise my hand. So how would my Torah learning actually practically save lives? Because I've heard that before. But is it like the air molecules of me studying Torah vibrate in a specific way so that it cascades hundreds of miles away, and then the bullet just barely misses someone? Like, does that seems a little far-fetched, but
it is a little far-fetched. We believe that there are different dimensions to reality, and one is a spiritual dimension, and it has effects on the physical world. And there can be real interactions between people based on those spiritual realities. So the way in which it was put, I guess 200 years ago, was that if a yeshiva student in Volozhin who's studying Gemara will pick up his eyes from the Gemara and daydream, a Jew in America will intermarry. That just shows you the different levels they're on, But I think you have to take this seriously. Otherwise, nothing in Yiddishkeit makes sense. For example, there are 613 commandments. No individual Jew has all 613 commandments addressed to him or her. And then you're told that there are 613 parts of the body, and each one is nourished by a particular commandment. So, if I, out of 613, only have 590, what's about the other 23? There are many answers, but one of the answers is that the Jewish people is a collective body, and when a Jew does a mitzvah, he transmits from that mitzvah a certain energy which enters the common bloodstream, and we all have the recycling of a common bloodstream, and therefore that mitzvah becomes available to other Jews who, of course, are part of that common bloodstream. It is possible to cut your traces from it, but if you don't, you have that common bloodstream. And not only that, but we are a single organism through time. So what about the mitzvahs, for example, of the temple, which we don't have? Well, 2,000 years ago, they were performed. And since they were performed, they injected a certain energy into the bloodstream of the Jewish people, and that energy remains. It's a little bit like a scar that you got from an accident you had when you were 6, and you're now 26, and the skin grows in the same shape of that scar, and you'll have it till you die. You're not injured now, but the injury leaves a mark on your body, and that mark on your body stays the same. So even though the generations pass, it's a single corporate body, and we have access to the mitzvahs that were done 2,000 years ago. That's all metaphysical. You're not going to find that in molecules. The other example I gave once, this came home to me, then I began to see it everywhere. In 1991, my parents both died 6 months apart, so I was in mourning for 18 months. And there's a compendium of laws called the Pnei Baruch, of the laws of mourning. And he asks the following question. One of the customs of someone who's mourning for a parent is to lead the prayers, to be the Chazan. Now let's imagine you're a member of a synagogue where there are 18 people who've lost parents, and each one wants to lead the prayers in honor of his parent. And there are 18 prayers a week that are available because on Shabbos you don't do it. And let's say you're number one. You have top choice. Which one should you choose out of the 18? So when I read the question in the Sefer, I thought to myself, what would I pick? Well, various choices that I chose were totally wrong. The right answer is the evening prayer Saturday night. Ma'ariv Motzei Shabbos. Wow, I thought, why is that? In the daytime you have Kedusha, there's an extra Kaddish, and Monday or Thursday you have the reading of the Torah. That's a big deal. Why would it be any evening prayer, and particularly Saturday night? And the answer that's given is, the soul of that parent, which is during the first year is undergoing a period of judgment. There's no judgment on Shabbos. Saturday night, that soul is transitioning from no judgment to judgment. At that moment of transition is when you, the child, can do the most for that soul. Your prayer has the most impact for that soul. That's why it's the best prayer to say. And second best during the week is all the other evening prayers, because when you go from daylight to darkness, the judgment intensifies. So again, when it's transitioning from the less to the more intense, if you are the chazan at that time, you do the most for that soul. So I thought to myself, well, so what I'm doing here depends upon what's going there. The significance of what I do here depends on what's going on there. That's a general theme in Torah. So without that understanding that there's a there, and that there has its own laws, you lose out on understanding how Judaism works. And I think that we have a kind of physical model for this. Ecology has taught us that there are interconnections in the physical world that we never dreamt of. This, maybe you remember, or maybe it's too far in the history for you, but there was a time when people didn't use spray cans because of the chlorofluorocarbons that come out of the spray cans and punch a hole in the ozone layer over the South Pole, mind you. They all migrate to South Pole, and there they punch a hole in the ozone layer. Why do they do that? What if they got against the South, I can hear already the politicos, South against North, and it's prejudicial and so on and so on. Even the molecules are, I don't know, that's where they go. That's where we found the hole, that's what's, and the food chain. Somebody said if all the plankton were to die, that would be the end of the planet. Because everything really, a great deal relies on the organisms that eat the plankton and then supply the food chain. So we know that now that things are connected in ways that we didn't believe, we didn't understand. They're even connected in ways that we still don't understand. So the Jewish message is, and there are things that are connected in ways that with systematic observation, telescopes and microscopes and mathematical theory, you also aren't going to understand because they're not accessible to that kind of investigation. That's the bottom line. Yeah.
What is people's big beef with Hasidus? There's some people, not here in Mechina per se, I'm saying in the whole program, if you bring up Hasidus, they'll look at you like you're stupid. What's their problem?
Well, you're asking a psychological and social question, and I suppose different people have different problems. I'll tell you one thing they all have in common, or almost all have in common, they don't know anything about it. And they've never experienced it. If they had studied some of the Hasidic works and seen the kinds of difficulty they possess and some of the insights that they provide, if they had realized some of the people in the non-Hasidic world who quote Hasidic sources and use them as a basis for their thinking, they also wouldn't have said something like that. And if they had experienced some of Hasidic style of traditional Jewish living, they also wouldn't have said that. So they're outsiders who, for whatever psychological reason, have decided to throw bricks. I don't think much of their character either. My son was involved and still involved in certain projects. He made a project in New York about 15 years ago, and there was a lot of skepticism as to whether it would be successful. It was phenomenally successful. But someone wrote 3 days beforehand on his blog, and he thinks of himself as an Orthodox commentator, "I'll give you my usual cynical view." I thought to myself, okay, which mitzvah exactly is it that tells you should be cynical? Which mitzvah are you doing? V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, should love your fellow Jew as yourself, or havidan kol chavschus, judge people favorably, and so on and so on. Where does it say in the Torah you should be cynical? Right? He was proud of being cynical because that's clever and sharp in modern terms. There's nothing Jewish about it. There's nothing Jewish about being cynical, and he was proud of it and put it out in the public sphere. So I think that there are people who are under psychological pressure for whatever reason, or their environment limits them in certain ways. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a sociologist, but one thing's for sure, they don't know anything about it. If you ask them what they know about it and ask them to quote sources, you get nothing.
But that's on an individual level. What are the political reasons or the overarching feuds between Chassids and everybody else?
I don't think there are so many anymore. After all, Agudas Israel is a worldwide organization which includes both Chassidim and non-Chassidim. So the idea that there are those kinds of feuds originally, when Chassidus was new, you had two phenomena. Number one, there were lots of rumors about Chassidus that weren't true. And number two, there were certain Chassidic groups that were very extreme. So, and what happened is over the centuries, last 2 centuries, what happened is two things. First of all, those really extreme groups didn't reproduce themselves, they didn't continue, and better information was made available to the world that was opposed. And then, like we said, the history is written by the winners. But in this case, both groups do, so each one writes this history differently. The Hasidic world says that our opponents didn't understand us. When they came to understand us, they came to accept us. And the opponents say our opposition caused them to drop their more radical elements and to reform themselves so as to become more normative, and that's why they were accepted. So, and I think both of those are true, and I think a third thing is true, that the so-called opponents adopted themselves Hasidic themes and Hasidic practices without their even noticing it. without their paying attention to it and admitting it. There was a coalescence of the different views to overcome the opposition. It's nothing like what it used to be, let's say, 200 years ago. And this is typical of Jewish history, something which I've spoken about, and other people pay very much. There have been radical disagreements, which in the context of other cultures would create two competing subcultures permanently. And in our case, over time, it may take a century or 2 centuries, over time, a reconciliation is created. This happens over and over again. So that in the world that claims itself to be observant, the world that claims itself to be faithful to the origin of Judaism, you really have acceptance of different groups rather than a schism between groups. Christianity split up into, I used to say, hundreds of different sects. Once we had a fellow here who came from a Christian background. He said, "Rabbi, you're making a mistake." I said, "Really?" "Yeah, because there's over 1,000. "Okay, gotcha. Okay, there's over 1,000. What do you, terrific." And in Islam, there are several different groups. And in Buddhism, there's a fundamental division between the origin of Buddhism, which was non-theist, and then 100 years later became theist by deifying Buddha. There are various schisms within, and in our case, the things that really divided people very vigorously have become overcome. Maimonides was doubly controversial. The Guide of the Perplexed was very controversial, and there are people who opposed it in principle and opposed him on those grounds. And that eventually was overcome. Rabbi Yonah wrote Shari Tshuva because he wanted to repent for opposing the Rambam. The Rambam wrote the first code of Jewish law. Before that, there were no codes of Jewish law. The Talmud is not a code, the Rif is not a code. And there are people and he didn't give his reasons. He just gave decisions. And that was very controversial. That was also overcome. Now there are hundreds of different codes in specific items. The Zohar was published, and there was some question as to its authenticity. Within a century, that was closed. So this, and by the way, I think Zionism is one like that also. I think it's being closed. It's being closed. Not fully closed yet, but it's being closed. So I think that the Hasidic and non-Hasidic, there was a time when if you weren't Hasidic, you wouldn't have in a Hasidic shul, you wouldn't marry into a Hasidic family, you wouldn't eat at a Hasidic meal. That's almost gone, almost completely gone. So I think that it's like the other ones. It's been overcome by time. Yeah.
The idea of being a Chassid is to try and get closer to God, though, right? Is that the idea of it, or?
I'll tell you, the best definition of Chassid that I know is in the Netilas Yadaim. By the word Chasid is more than 3,000 years old. It wasn't invented for people with fur hats. And indeed, there were even Hasidic groups before what we call Hasidism. Rabbi Yehuda Chasid wasn't a Chasid in our sense, in our times. Chasid, I guess, colloquially, Chasid means especially pious. Ramchal, in the Netilas Yadaim, the 18th chapter, defines a Chasid as someone whose purpose is to please God. Purpose is to please God. And he opposes that, and others before him opposed it, to tzaddik. Tzaddik is someone whose purpose is to do what's right, to do what's obligatory, to do what's correct. And the difference is, of course, he's doing what's right because God wants it to be done. There's no question about that. But it's the idea that tzaddik is there's a code which came from God. I know I'm obligated to serve God, like the Netilas Yadaim starts with. The person has to know ma chovaso ba'olamo, what is his obligation in his world, and here's a set of obligations, and the tzaddik says, I'm going to live up to them. My actions will be right actions. The Chasid, according to the Netilas Yadaim, says, I want to do what will please God. And the difference in attitude is this. You imagine a person at the end of the day checking on his day. How was his day? Well, the tzaddik has a set of rules. Okay. Here's rule number 1. Did I do number rule 1? Yep, check it off. Here's number 2. If he can check off all the rules, then he had a good day because he satisfied all the rules. the Chassid says, what did I do to please HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Now, what difference will it come out from? One is going beyond the set of rules. The Chassid typically wants to go beyond the set of rules, that what the rules strictly demand, to things which either are improved performance of the rules or other things which the Torah has revealed to us which aren't laid down in the rules. Even Rabban talks about that, Mr. Yadaim talks about that. And it's a question of his experience. Now, this is what you said about getting close to the Kodesh Baruch Hu. Here, he has the Kodesh Baruch Hu in mind. See if I can give you an example of what I mean. Maybe this will help. Imagine a person, God forbid, who's suffering from severe burns. Now imagine two types of care. One is medical care. One of the things is there are salves which you can put on the person's body to help relieve the pain. And the nurse knows that once an hour, these salves have to be put on. And the nurse knows how to do it. Is trained how to do it and puts it on in exactly the right way. Now imagine the child of the person who puts the salve on. The child will put it on with love. Maybe the touch will be the same. You may be indistinguishable because the nurse is very good. But the child will do it with love. The child has the person in mind. The nurse has the burns in mind. So you talk about connection. Obviously, the child is connected to the person in a way that the nurse isn't connected to the person. The nurse is connected to the burns. So there's a difference in relationship to a Kodesh Baruch Hu that way. I think that's exactly right. Because his purpose, what he has in mind is, will a Kodesh Baruch Hu be pleased with what I'm doing? And then he looks at the rules. Yeah, he's going to follow the rules, but his attitude is a Kodesh Baruch Hu going to be pleased? He's connected to Kodesh Baruch Hu in a way that the other person isn't. I think that's right. Yeah.
I was just reading this book, With All Your Heart, Practical Approach to Bitachon, and it was talking about why some prayers are accepted and some not. And it was talking about somebody who was born under an unlucky star, and that person might have to daven harder in order to get their prayers answered. I was curious if you could talk about that.
Well, you're reading an English translation. I'd be interested to see what the Hebrew was and what he footnotes. I'm not aware of that particular effect of so-called an unlucky star, but there's an idea like this. I'll give you the example that the Gemara gives, and then I'll try to fill it out. There's something called mazel ma'adim. Now, a mazel is associated with, I don't say it means or it designates, but associated with certain astronomical entities. And this is the planet of Mars, which in fact does look red often in the sky. And the Gemara says, someone born under the influence of that mazel will spill blood. He will spill blood. There are three ways in which it might happen. He might be a murderer, or he might be a ritual slaughterer who creates kosher meat, or he might be a moil who does circumcisions and inducts Jewish children into the covenant of Abraham. My addition is, if he'll be a librarian and somebody brings back a book late, out come the scissors, because he's going to spill blood. That's all there's to it. So the message of that Chazal is, there's a certain physical feature that his life is going to have, but the spiritual status of that physical feature is up to him. He can make it one way or the other way. And there's actually a statement in Torah itself with a explanation of Chazal, which says this very explicitly. Shimon and Levi wiped out the city of Shechem. Okay, that's a whole story I'm not going into now. Yaakov, when he was on his deathbed, when he blessed all the children, he said to them, I'm going to divide you in the Jewish people. You're not going to have any concentrated presence. Well, they ended up both divided, but in two very, very different ways. Levi became a semi-holy tribe where they were supported by a tithe of all the agricultural produce that the Jewish people produce, and they spent their time learning Torah and teaching Torah to the Jewish people and performing functions in the temple. And their premises were cities of the Jewish people, 48 cities that they had scattered throughout the entire geography. So they were not localized in one place. Shimon was given a portion of a tribe, but they were very poor, they're not successful, and they became teachers of students and so forth and so on. And the population just leaked out over and became divided in the Jewish people. So both are divided, but in very, very different ways. Because Levi put himself in a position where the division would work itself out in a positive way. And Shimon didn't do that. So again, what's determined from above is a certain physical status, but its spiritual status, its moral status, isn't determined. That's determined by the person's own practice. That's number one. Now, number two, there's something called Mazel Elyon and Mazel Tachton. Now I'm going to give you a definition of Mazel, which we didn't do before. Mazel comes from a verb in Hebrew which means to flow. Nozel is what water does. When left alone, it flows. When you say Mazel Tov to someone, what you're really saying to him is good flow. You got a good flow from above. And the spirit of saying Mazel Tov is like the spirit that you would have when somebody calls you up and said you got a promotion. Say, wow, that's great. Wow, that's great. What happened to you is a good thing that happened to you. I think that's a very noble sentiment. It's a good sentiment. From our point of view, it didn't just happen. It's a flow from above. So Mazel Tov is a congratulation on having a good Mazel that flowed from above. Now, Mazel has different effects on your position of the world. And here, I'm not going to make perfect contact with what you quoted from the book, but at least it'll be in the same ballpark. Ramchal says this word for word, and Podesta says it. Quotes Tosfos, who says it. A person's put in the world to perform a certain service, a certain function. Ramchal says that Kodesh Baruch Hu divides up human conditions into different niches, and each niche has its particular challenges, and therefore living in that niche gives the opportunity to achieve a certain type of perfection. And they have very different types of challenges. So, for example, the Gemara talks about poverty versus wealth. And there's a verse in Proverbs, I think I'm quoting it correctly, or maybe it's just a paraphrase. It says, Pen ivaresh v'ganavti, lest I become impoverished and steal. Pen ezba v'kichashti, lest I become wealthy and deny God. So, the verse, first of all, tells you there's a test of poverty, the test of wealth. The normal failure of the test of poverty is to steal, because you don't have enough for yourself, that's what you think. And the normal failure of being wealthy is to deny God, because you want to take credit for what you have. You want to say that you earned it, you deserved it, you created it for yourself. The self-made man, they did used to talk that way in English. And then, if it really came from a Kodesh Baruch Hu, your ego loses out. So you deny that the Kodesh Baruch Hu is running the world, so you can take credit for it. Obviously, the failure of wealth is much worse than the failure of poverty. It's a much worse failure, and therefore the challenge is a much more dangerous challenge. Now, Mazel Elyon is the particular challenge you were inserted into, the niche in the world you were inserted into, to make your contribution of conquering that niche. That can't be changed. That can't be changed. That's what you were created for. If you pray to change the niche, the prayer will not be answered, or it will be answered no, the way the Kotzker said it. Everyone prayer gets answered, just so that the answer is no. Right? Because that's what you were created for. That's Mazel Elyon, the upper Mazel. Mazel Tachton is the means that you were given to be able to fulfill that purpose. That could be changed. Because if you could fulfill the same purpose in a different way, you were born to fulfill that purpose, but there are different ways of fulfilling it. So Rav Dessler gives the example of someone whose purpose was to promote the study of Torah. And he was born poor, into a very poor community, and he's teaching the young students, for which he's paid a meager salary, and he's living in poverty. And he's praying to have more money. Could happen that he'll get much more money, he'll move to a big city, and then because he's wealthy, the various Torah institution of the city will come to him for help, and he will be able to support them so as to promote more Torah study. So he's fulfilling the same goal in just under different conditions. So the impact of Mazel on prayer is some prayers aren't going to be answered at all. So for example, let's take, by the way, there's a very important lesson here. If you see somebody who's poor, don't think, well, he must be failing somewhere spiritually, because if he were really doing what God wants, God wouldn't leave him poor. That's dead wrong. That's dead wrong. It may be that he was put into the world to conquer the challenges of poverty. It has nothing to do with his having failed at all. You can't draw any conclusions about a person's success and failure from the conditions that you find him in. Same thing with illness. A person may have been born. I have a friend. I wasn't aware of this till just the last week. He has a granddaughter who has no control over her body, only her eyes. And she moves the cursor on a computer with her eye motions. That was developed some time ago. She runs a design business, which is very successful, and she has studied a lot of Jewish literature, especially philosophical literature, and she gives lectures. She just gave a lecture in the city of Netanya to 500 women who came to hear her lecture. And she imparts her understanding, and she talks about her joy of being alive. She talks about the gifts that God has given her. That's breathtaking. That's really breathtaking. But that's what you can do if you ask yourself, with what I have, what can I do? It could be, I'm not speaking about her, I don't know. Could be that 10 years from now there'll be an operation and everything will be restored. But it could be that she was put in the world to do the best with that slot that she can do to conquer the challenge of that slot. She's certainly doing that with that slot that she has now. Whether, again, I'm not saying that but here's an example of something where a person can be put in a slot and then the prayers to change the slot aren't going to work. So that's impact on prayer. Now you're quoting him as saying you could be in a position where you have to pray harder to be heard. It could be that person was put in the world to perfect prayer, and only by making it harder for the prayers to be answered will that person perfect prayer. That could be.
I believe you also mentioned that our forefathers were born under, possibly I could be completely off on this, but they were born under unlucky stars, and that's why they had to pray so much in order to receive.
So unlucky. That's not the choice of term that we would have used, right? They're put under the star, which requires the conquest of a certain challenge. Well, I think, in a certain sense, that's right. Although the explanations are various. For example, you're probably aware that the four matriarchs were barren, right? Sarah had to wait decades to have a child. And Rebecca, we know Isaac had to pray for her, and Rachel went years without children, and Leah, the Torah says explicitly, only had children because Hashem opened her womb and made it possible for her to do that. But when she started off, didn't have that possibility. What many people don't know is the oral tradition says that the patriarchs were also barren. The men were also barren. And the implication of that is that their ability to have children is miraculous. They were meant to be not natural, but miraculous. The very fact that they'll have children is all direct divine action. Divine action. So that's one reason why it was that way, and that's one reason why the prayers weren't heard, because their procreation had to be miraculous rather than natural. That will imply that there will be a long time of prayer, and until it happens. Could be that was another reason also, that it was so. That they had to show their trust and their reliance on the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even after many, many years of not being answered, to continue to pray and to show that they hadn't lost their trust in the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That also could be. So that is also possible. But I hope it's not taken as unlucky and too bad and, you just lost out. That's not appropriate with divine providence. It means this soul was chosen for this particular niche to create this kind of perfection. And by the way, just one little more piece of background. All of our souls are, so to speak, slices of Adam's soul. So his challenge was to create the sum total of human perfection in one performance. And that failed. And what has replaced it is a fragmentation of the effort, a division of labor into myriads and myriads of individual souls, each of which has a particular niche that it has to perfect. That's a kind of global picture of what's going on. Yeah.
I just want to, before I ask this question, I want to double check. You said you taught formal logic in math, right? Okay, so as a two-parter, I'm guessing that means you're more partial to analytic philosophy over continental, but
absolutely,
Okay.
Absolutely. When I was a professor, they had a conference in Canada, bringing the two sides together and hoping to achieve some kind of interaction. It was a 3-day conference. There was interaction, all right. Each one was throwing bricks at the other.
So
Yeah.
what amount of Goyish philosophy is like basically nonsense? Because it feels like a lot of the time people are just like, whatever, they're like regurgitating philosophers at each other and they're just talking in circles. And what amount of philosophy that isn't formal logic has any like validity or use to us?
Well, it's something called analytical philosophy, which isn't just formal logic. But the idea is to try to create precise definitions of concepts and to then see how the concepts relate to one another and to try to build a structure with which you can understand a lot on the basis of a few basic assumptions, which way you organize the whole area and you come to a deeper understanding of it. I taught at Johns Hopkins. We had a small department, only 10 of us, and you have to have 3 faculty members sit in on the review of the defense of the thesis. So sometimes we had to sit on other people's subjects which weren't our own. There was a guy who wrote a thesis on Nietzsche, not under me, obviously, but they asked me to sit in. So at the defense, I just happened to ask the student and also his advisor who knew Nietzsche, could you give me an example of one argument in Nietzsche where the terms in the argument are defined in reasonably clear terms and logic is provided so that someone who was neutral or skeptical would have a reason now to change his mind because the argument forced the conclusion. One in the whole corpus of Nietzsche. And the answer I got was no. So I said, okay. For me, as an analytical philosopher, there's nothing there. However, Thomas Nagel, for whom I have all the respect in the world, wrote an article on Nietzsche where he described what Nietzsche was trying to do. Well, he wasn't an analytical philosopher. But was a way of describing a situation, not proving your description is right, but describing it in such comprehensive terms and seeing linkages between things that it becomes somewhat convincing that maybe the description is right, without any proofs, without any arguments. John Wisdom wrote an article about that, interesting name for a philosopher, I read many years ago, and I thought, aha, so maybe there's something out there that I'm missing. Not that there's anything wrong with what I'm doing, but my prejudice that what they're doing is nothing may be an inappropriate prejudice. Now, I was trained the way I was trained, and I did the work that I did within the tradition that I was part of. So I wouldn't simply dismiss it, but the question is, what are you doing when you're reading it? So if you're an analytic philosopher or reading analytical philosophy, you want to have reasons for accepting or rejecting certain beliefs. And the reason should be clear. This is the belief, this is its implications, this is what it's related to, and there's a superior belief or arguments given aren't good arguments, so forth and so on. People who are doing continental philosophy are looking for a kind of vision of how things work. And without proving to the other person that the vision is true, still the vision gives them some kind of grasp, some kind of understanding. You can see how it will be very difficult for the two groups to communicate with one another. According to the continental philosophers, the analytical philosophers are like, playing in the sand. Okay, you built a wonderful sandcastle. Just don't stay for after the next wave, because it's going to wash away anyhow. Right? And you're just building sandcastles. You're not dealing with the reality of the totality of life. And the others are saying, you're talking, poetry, which that's nice, but since you have no reason to convince anybody that what you say is true, so it's just a kind of entertainment. It's not real. I don't think either one is doing real justice to the other. But I can't say anything about the other because I wasn't trained in it. I haven't dealt with it. So, but now when I'll tell you this, I use very often the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's very, very good. Not always, and not everything is perfect, but it's very good. Written by experts in the field. And the typical article is a certain subject. Here are the main questions that the subject deals with. Here are the 5 main theories about this subject. There are the strengths and the weaknesses and the objections to each one. And here's our hope for future progress. Well, I think that's very indicative. There aren't many conclusions. There aren't many principles of philosophy that even a large plurality of philosophers believe in, let alone a majority of philosophers believe in. There are a lot of views, and the views have strengths and weaknesses. My particular place was philosophy of mathematics. I started in the 70s. In the 90s, Hilary Putnam, one of the leaders in that field, among other fields, wrote an article, Philosophy of Mathematics, Why Nothing Works. There were at least 3 major approaches to philosophy of mathematics in the 20th century. Sorry. They're still around now. Here we've gone to a quarter of the 21st century, and they're still around and still worrying about it. Still. I took a seminar with one of my colleagues on probability. There are 5 different approaches to probability. There are still 5 different approaches to probability, and they're still arguing it out. They haven't settled anything. So, well, I think it opens your mind a little bit to possibilities. And for my purposes, if there's a Jewish position and somebody says, you're just out of date, we now know that that's nonsense. I look at them at Stanford and I see, well, let's see. 2 out of 5 positions on this issue say that our position is reasonable. It doesn't prove we're right, but it certainly means no one's proven we're wrong. And I think that's something that's worthwhile knowing. Do people, you sort of alluded to people who quote philosophical phrases. Yeah, that's a lot of that. And it's usually thoughtless and irresponsible, and I can't support that. These are serious people doing serious work, but it's a very unsettled field. It's a field with a lot of things left open, and it wasn't always that way. When Kant started writing his philosophy, there was a few decades where people thought, "Yeah, we really got it. This is it. Okay, a few ends here and there, a few distinctions to be made, but really, basically, Kant has solved it. He really put it on a solid footing. That lasted for a few decades, and then it went to pieces. And since then, it's really gone to pieces. Yeah, last question. Oh, I'm sorry. You had a question? I'm sort of in this side room. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a short question. So, for example, if I see somebody do Netilas Yadaim with like a ring on his finger, and I know it should be off, is there like an obligation for me for him to take it off? And if no, should I be saying that to people?
Okay, this is a very good question. Now, I'll tell you why it's a very good question. Because there may not be any reason to take it off. That's right. Check the halacha first. We had a guy here 43 years ago who didn't want to go home for Rosh Hashanah. His parents were like right-wing conservative. And he wrote his parents a letter. And they were very upset. And he asked me what to do. I said, let me see the letter. He said, here's the letter. And he gave 10 reasons why he didn't want to go home. All of them were wrong. Every last one of them was wrong. He didn't ask anybody. So I said, first thing to do, write a letter to your parents and beg their forgiveness because you caused them needless worry. And then we talked about the rest of it. As a matter of fact, if your practice is to wear the ring all the time and never take it off, you don't have to take it off. I know this because happens with women all the time. That they have a wedding ring and an engagement ring, and they typically wear it if they wear it all the time, then they don't have to take it off when they wash. So first of all, check the halacha, and then the second thing is talk about bringing something to someone's attention. Well, I can tell you now, it's a general attitude about life. Go to interact with another person. Ask yourself before you interact, what do you want the result to be? How do you want to walk away from it? And then ask yourself, can I do this? Can I act in such a way as to get that result? People often interact with others motivated by, how am I going to feel about myself rather than how I felt about the interaction. And if you can't point it out to the person in such a way that he'll thank you and be grateful and be happy to do with what you want, ask him to do, then I think you should think twice about doing it. We had a guy here. The guy came in from Yale, and he just came in like on Thursday, and he knew absolutely nothing. Shabbos morning, he slept until 10:30, and then he came down to the meal, and he saw everybody taking the cup and busily dripping water on their hands. So he picked it up, and he did it a certain way, and somebody came over and said, "No, you don't do it that way. That's not right. You have to do it this way." He picked up his bags and ran. This is a place where they yell at you for how you wash your hands? They gotta be crazy. He's right, that guy was crazy. What's the matter with you? And he himself came in 18 months ago. He forgot what he was 18 months ago. So you have to be very conscious of the psychological impact and take responsibility for it. That's the bottom line. Yes, of course, if you can bring it to someone's attention and have him improve his adherence and appreciate it, by all means. I'll tell you one more story, then I have to go. There was a guy who came in also off the street. It was much more common in those days. And he was put in a room with guys who were here in the yeshiva. And one of the guys in the yeshiva came back from davening and saw this new guy standing in front of the mirror, face with lathered up, a stick razor in his hands, and his face half shaved. Okay? One side shaved, one side not. And he must have looked startled, the yeshiva bacher. So the guy said, "Oh, is something wrong?" And then they asked me, what should he have said? They didn't tell me what he did say. But they told me what he should have said. And I said, he should have said, you know what? There is something to talk about, but now's not the time. We'll get to it later. And let him shave the other half of his face. Because he's not ready. He's not ready for it. You tell him, yeah, put it down. Wash your face off. No, don't touch the rest of it. He'll be gone. He'll be gone, all right. And then he'll finish shaving his face. Okay, tomorrow we have another shot.